Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Leonard Mlodinow, third time on the show. He's our returning champion. Let's see, I had him on for his book Subliminal, and then his next book after that was the memoir of Stephen Hawking, as Len has worked with Hawking on several books and also kind of a theory of everything. His new book is Emotional, How Feelings Shape Our Thinking. Leonard has received his PhD in theoretical physics from the University of California, Berkeley, was an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Max Planck Institute, and was on the faculty of the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. His previous books include the bestsellers The Grand Design and A Briefer History of Time, both with Stephen Hawking, Subliminal, which I mentioned, and The Drunkard's Walk, which I use in my Skepticism 101 course because it's a great work on the role of probability and chance and randomness in life, of which we impose patternicity all over that randomness and infer agency behind it, what often turns out to just be randomness. His book on Elastic was on creative thinking and history of creativity. And the new book is on emotions. That is, what are emotions? How do we define them? How do they differ from feelings, moods, drives, passions, and so on? What do we mean by these different words? A little bit of the history of that, the influence of culture on emotions, context on emotions, the interaction of physiological changes in the body associated with emotions, and the context in which those emotions occur. A lot of interesting research on that Len reviews in our conversation. The difference between wanting and liking something, which is important for understanding drug addiction, for example. Drug addicts don't necessarily like the drugs, but they want them. What's the difference there? What do we mean by those words? Of course, we get into the nature-nurture debate. To what extent did emotions evolve for adaptive purposes, and therefore they're largely biologically determined versus the role of culture? Here our antagonists are Paul Ekman and his theory about the universal nature of emotions, and Lisa Feldman Barrett, who challenges his theory of universal emotions, and she points out the many differences both in culture and context in which emotions vary quite a bit, much more like a spectrum. We talk about love, hate, anger, fear, disgust, pleasure, pain, hunger, thirst, loss, attraction, desires, passions, and what all those things mean in the context of the discussion on emotions in general and their origins. And then we wrap up talking about negative emotions, how to control your emotions, the different kind of strategies you can use to get control of your emotions. And then we talk about AI and programming emotions. Len used to write for Star Trek, so he knows the data character quite well, and points out that you can't program in emotions from the top down in a reflective way, that it has to be an emergent property from neural network programming. And this is much more parallel to actual evolution of emotions in animals and humans. And then we wrap up from there. So it's a fascinating conversation. Len is one of the most interesting people writing today, longtime good friend, and really interesting to have a top theoretical physicist thinking about psychology, human problems, sociology, anthropology, social psychology, and all these different subjects, because he comes at it from a different perspective, which I really appreciate. So if you enjoyed this conversation and the podcast in general, please give us some support at skeptic.com/donate. That's skeptic.com/donate to support the Skeptic Society in general, which is the main sponsor of this podcast. All right, thanks for listening. Today's episode is brought to you by Wondrium, Wondrium, Wondrium.com, which is a access subscription service to all things learning, wisdom, knowledge, science, rationality, history, philosophy, economics, politics, food, wine, photography, just about anything you want. It's a great system. I've been using this since the 90s, back when they used to ship the courses you would buy through the Great Courses Teaching Company, which is the former name of Wondrium, in boxes on cassette tape. So we've come a long ways. Now everything, of course, is digitized, accessible online through streaming. You just open up your app, like this is what I do on my phone. I have my Wondrium app ready to go. I pop it open. Here's one that I've been sampling. The History and Archaeology of the Bible. As most of my followers know, I'm not a particularly religious person, but I'm deeply interested in religion and the history of religion. So this is a perfect course delve into the iconic stories of the Bible through the eyes of historians and archaeologists and discover how their findings bring fascinating and revealing perspectives to the world-shaping texts of Scripture. So here's just a few: the world of Genesis, the Tower of Babel, Joseph in Egypt, the story of Moses, the mystery of the Exodus. The mystery is there's no archaeological evidence at all that there was this large population of people living in the desert for all those years and left nothing behind. So what's the story with the Exodus? Are these myths and stories with moral homilies, or did they actually happen? Anyway, that's the idea behind this. Kingdom of David, there does appear to be archaeological evidence for the existence of David, as well as Solomon and some of the others. This goes all the way up to the New Testament, the birth of Jesus, young Jesus, Jesus and John the Baptist, the ministry of Jesus, the Passover events, the rise of Christianity, and so on. 24, 30-minute lectures. If you listen to them at 1.2 speed like I do, you can get through them in about 20 to 22 minutes each. And it's great. You just do it while you're driving, cycling, hiking, walking, doing chores, weeding, whatever you're doing. So the offer here for my listeners is if you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, you get a 22-day free trial. So it costs you nothing. And if you want to subscribe after that, you can. And why wouldn't you? So go to Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, SHERMER. Just go do it. It's great. All right. Thanks for listening. And here's the show. So your new book is Emotional: How Feelings Shape Our Thinking. So my wife, Jennifer, had the first question for me to ask you. So how are you feeling, Len?
I'm feeling excitement, enthusiasm, and a lot of positive emotion just by being here with you, Michael. I always love seeing you, and it's been too long. So I know if it was later in the day, we would have a drink, but I'll say cheers with my coffee.
Oh, yes, we have coffee instead of old fashions like we usually do.
Yeah, and by the way, I wore this shirt just for you, so there you can see it. Science.
Yeah, there it is. Science doesn't care what you believe.
There you go.
Right.
I figure what could be a better shirt for the skeptics.
Although, yeah, that's a good skeptic slogan T-shirt. But I must ask you, how does that fit with your model-dependent realism that you and Stephen Hawking developed? Doesn't that depend? Isn't a belief system a kind of model?
Well, the science doesn't care what you believe. No, the reality that you believe depends on what you believe. The reality you experience does depend on what you believe, but science doesn't. We would like to think that science has been designed to give reproducible results.
Right. So as long as you're getting reproducible results, the model you're using, this is your model-dependent realism that you and Hawking developed in the grand design, which I've always been fascinated by because it hints toward kind of a postmodernism, not relativism of knowledge, but that, how you construct the question or come at it is going to very much influence what it is you find and how you interpret the results of your experiments, right?
Right, and there can be different theories that have the same predictions that are equally valid and have and lead to completely different models of what's going on. It happens in quantum theory, for example. If you look at Feynman's formulation of quantum theory versus Heisenberg's versus Schrodinger's, and now they all give the same answers, but the description of the universe that they give you is quite different. But I'm feeling like we're getting astray here from our emotions, although that makes me.
No, that's okay. No, because. And let's move that mic a little closer to you,
okay.
So we get your volume just a little bit up. Yeah, no, but I find this fascinating because here you are, a trained PhD physicist who worked with Stephen Hawking and taught at Caltech, and you're writing a book about emotions. You've branched out. What I like about your career and is that you've kind of tried different things. So in a way, I feel like I'm getting an interpretation of something like emotions from somebody who's not just an egghead in the ivory tower, but that you've worked in corporate America, you wrote for Star Trek, you've had kind of a real life, so to speak, in addition to your academic life. So just kind of give us a little bit of background how you ended up shifting from writing about physics with Stephen Hawking to writing books about, like your previous book, Subliminal, and now Emotional.
Well, I was at Caltech, and I had a good friend. I was on the faculty there, and a good friend who was a famous neuroscientist who studied consciousness. And I got very interested in consciousness through him. You know him, Christoph Koch. And
Oh
I
yeah.
I participated in his group, in his meetings, in his research seminars, took several courses, and started reading wildly about this stuff through him in around 2005, I think it was, or six, and got very interested because maybe originally it was spurred by my interest in how we think and how, let's say, physicists think compared to people who are operating in ordinary world, or how people in any profession think. But what does it mean to think? What does it mean to feel? And all these questions. And in that time was a very exciting time in neuroscience, because all sorts of new experimental techniques, in particular imaging techniques, were coming online. And so what had been a soft science of psychology, which is one that maybe doesn't attract physicists so much, became a much harder science of neuroscience, or the neuroscience / psychology. And so I kind of got sucked into learning about all that. And through Christoph's encouragement, I wrote my first psychology neuroscience book called Subliminal: How Your Unconscious Mind Rules Your Behavior. He had convinced me not to write about consciousness, but that we know so much more about the unconscious mind, and it has a hidden influence on all your decisions and your thoughts and your behavior, and has an influence that we can quantify and measure in the lab and study, but also that you're not aware of. That's very enlightening when you come to become aware of it. So I wrote that book, and after that I wrote a book called Elastic on how we get ideas and creativity. And I see this as this emotional, in a way, is the climax of that, because it's really the most important and key book about how your thoughts and what you think are rational mental calculations are influenced in a way that you're perhaps not aware of, and that's through your emotions. So I kind of see them as a grouping of books that the culmination of something I've been studying for about 15 years now. But I also think, by the way, that
I do think.
Sorry, I say I think that my approach to it as a physicist diving into the neuroscience and psychology literature gives me an interesting perspective, because I in physics is a very hard science where everything is we try to define things very precisely and are very careful in our pronouncements. And so moving into the other field, I think I came with a good dose of skepticism, and I was able to dive through what's really, in the last decade or two, a very explosive amount of literature in a revolutionary period in that field of emotion. And so it was interesting to be able to try and look at it from the very logical physics point of view, and synthesize what's been going on, and then come up with the book.
Yeah, but don't you think, you mentioned the hard sciences. To me, it seems like the social sciences are the real hard sciences, because there's so many more variables that you have to take into account, and the statistical models used to tease out the causal vectors and figure out which one has 70% causal account of the variance, and another one has 10%, and one has 5%, and how you figure that out. That's really hard. Maybe it's not quantum physics hard in terms of the math, but answering the question is hard. Why do we feel a certain way, and what are emotions? That strikes me as a really hard question. And I think the so-called hard problem of consciousness is going to underlie our entire conversation, because when you say, well, I feel a certain way, and that's associated with an increase in dopamine or serotonin or oxytocin, or the rage circuit is triggered. But why should just a bunch of molecules floating across a synapse, these are just physical systems, how would that give rise to the experience of feeling anger or love or whatever?
That is the question that I originally started with, the question that Christoph was studying and is still studying. Let me just say that it's interesting what at the beginning of your question. talking about physics versus social science as a hard science. I never viewed the word hard in its meaning of as difficult. And I may be wrong here, but when I hear the word hard science, when I view that as hard like a rock. And I'm not sure why that describes physics to me, but hard versus soft is the way I feel that it's less flexible because it's more subject to verification and precise experiment, well-defined experiment. And experiments in the social sciences I view as soft because you can push around the concepts a little bit. They tend to be a little vaguer, and so, or even not agreed upon. Quite often, you read the literature and you realize that different researchers have different definitions for these things. Now, I agree with you that if you're interpreting hard as difficult, I wouldn't say that physics is a hard science. I think social sciences are harder. It's to even come up with the concepts, as I said, and definitions of them that are precise, agreed upon, and meaningful. And to do experiments, it's all much harder than, in some sense at least, much more difficult than in physics. So yeah, it depends on what sense you're looking at the term.
Well, it's just that we social scientists often feel like we're the third kid on the block that doesn't get the respect that we deserve, and in part it's because it is hard. It's hard to quantify these things. So I'll return to your book here with your chapter on your emotional profile, where you have these different instruments that psychologists use to try to quantify emotions. For example, the anxiety inventory, in which you are to assign yourself a 1 through 4 rating for each of these 20 different items. I'll just read off a couple. So 1 is almost never, 2 is sometimes, 3 is often, and 4 is almost always. So 1, I feel secure. Well, I would say often, me. I'm cool, calm, and collected. Often, so I'd give that a 3. I make decisions easily. I'd say a 2. I'm content, maybe a 4, but not always. Depends on what time of the day you ask me, right? So I'm happy. Well, I'm happy, yeah. But do you mean like right now, or do you mean like on average for the last month, or do you mean for the last 10 years? All of a sudden, even if you have a quantifiable operational definition of anxiety as a score of 10 to 20, a score between 10 and 20 means you're anxious. That's really hard, right?
It is. And to answer a couple of the points you brought up, the instructions say first of all, that there's a number of questions. So you might have trouble going, is it a 2 or a 3? You just pick one. It averages out. Some you might pick, it's 2.5, you might pick the 2 for, some you might pick the 3. It's supposed to talk about not how you feel with regard to something that just happened, but in general, what's your, how often or how often do you feel anxiety over time recently, not your whole life? And so what state, are you in it? They're designed to tell what's your propensity, in a sense, toward these emotions. And what's interesting about them is, first of all, by reading them as you did, you get an idea of the definition of emotion. What do these researchers think about when they talk about anxiety? And it also makes it more personal to you. And I hope that it gets people to think about your own way of thinking. We talk about, for example, in happiness, a lot has been said about your set point for happiness, and that's been debated whether there is one or there isn't. How much is it affected by events? But that kind of analysis is true for every emotion. You have a certain tendency toward anxiety or toward fear. And what's interesting about these inventories, they call them, is how they reflect how the researchers look at those emotions, and also it makes it a personal connection for you. So each of these inventories that I found were published in scientific papers, and they've been validated by testing them on hundreds or thousands of subjects. And what they first do is they test them and they get a distribution of the scores, but they also retest them later dates to see if it's stable, and they test with other groups to see if it varies much between groups. And when they work all that out, then they've come up with these questions. But of course, it's not anything as it's not anything as definite and precise and unshakable, perhaps, as what we see at the LHC in Geneva when we smash elementary particles together. But even in physics now, there's some exciting news going on about muons and about whether there's another force or particles that we're not aware of. The first perhaps cracks in the standard model in 40 years or so. So even in physics, exciting things can happen. But yeah, it's definitely a lot more variable with experiments such as the ones that use the inventories in the book.
Yeah. But I think kind of subjectively, we all know what we're talking about when we say, like if you said, I'm feeling a little anxious today, I would have some idea of what you're talking about just from my own experiences. So we can kind of understand, gain some empathy with each other just by the, I guess, common use of these words. But so let's just go to the beginning here. I mean, you use the word emotion. That's the commonly used word. But how does that differ from like feelings or moods or drives or passions? Like the Adams, you quoted Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So sentiments is one of these 18th century words. What do you mean sentiments? So the language changes historically. How do you think about those different words?
Well, first I should say that yes, the language and the scientific view of emotion has changed historically, and between Darwin and just the last couple decades, there's been a huge change in what we mean by emotion. Maybe I should start by talking about Darwin's theory a little bit, because Darwin's theory, I think of Darwin's theory as being something like Newton's theory of physics. It was very intuitive. It seemed to describe what's going on around us, and it's wrong. And wrong in the quotes, in the scientific sense, meaning that Newton's theory does not tell you what the fundamental laws of nature are or what's really going on if you look closely enough. But they're an approximation that are fine for our macroscopic dealings in the macroscopic world. But if you look closely enough to see atoms and subatomic particles, you'll find that the actual laws are much different, but they appear on the macroscopic level to be Newton's laws. And similarly, I think Darwin's theory, which was based on the original Platonic and later Christian Platonic idea of feeling emotion and that it's somewhat counterproductive. Darwin's theory created really what I think is the first scientific theory of emotion, and it really held and dominated people's thinking for over 100 years. And as you can imagine, what was Darwin looking to do? Well, he had this theory of evolution, and now he's looking at emotion. He's wondering how this fits together, because if emotions are counterproductive, if they get in the way, if they go crazy on you, why would we have them? And of course, Darwin started looking at other animals, non-human animals, and he concluded that all animals have emotion, and that emotion really arose as a kind of a way of communicating. So animals that don't have language, that have to cooperate, or maybe that are in conflict, and if you want to avoid a fight, you have to communicate how important is this to me? How angry am I? How fierce am I? And then hopefully the weaker animal will go away instead of they half kill each other and one wins. That doesn't get anyone anywhere. Or if one animal is trying to tell his conspecifics that there are predators in the area, a bird wants to warn the other birds in the flock and so forth. So this kinds of expressions of emotion arose in the animal world, but Darwin thought that in the human world they were a vestige. They were somewhat like the appendix. That we don't really need them anymore because we have language and we have logical, rational reasoning. And so the emotions don't play an important role, as important a role. Of course, we still communicate with each other through facial expressions and whatnot. But he thought that they had been largely superseded and that they do get in the way. And so Darwin posited that there were certain, what he called basic emotions that are, they're anger, fear, sadness, happiness, joy, disgust. So those emotions are the basic emotions, and that each of those emotions is unitary, meaning that it applies to all cases like that. So there's only one fear. There's not fear of spiders versus a different fear when you're suffocating. And so he thought there were basic emotions, that they were unitary, that they were distinct, so that there's a sharp line, let's say, between fear and anger. And in later years, scientists concluded that each emotion is attached to certain parts of your brain. And so there's a specific center for the different emotions. For example, in the 90s, it was very big to talk about the amygdala and fear. And that was very intuitive, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's a great way to talk about emotions because we don't always need all the nuance. So when I'm in the real world, for example, and a book falls, I think of it in terms of Newton's laws, not in terms of quantum theory, right? But when you look deeper, and what scientists have found in the last 20 or so years is that he's wrong in almost all counts, okay? So, for example, fear, I mentioned fear. They've done experiments to differentiate between, to show that in the brain, fear of a spider or a snake is different than fear of suffocating. And in fact, they took a person who had a bilateral amygdala damage, who because of that, could not experience some types of fear. She could still experience other types of fear, showing that fear that there's more than one kind of fear. And I mentioned the amygdala. It's true that the amygdala has a role in fear, but the reason we say it's not really associated with fear anymore the way it used to be is we know that it's not even necessary. It's just one part of many structures in your brain that have to do with fear. It's necessary for some kinds of fear, not for others, and it plays a role in other emotions than fear. But so fear is not just one emotion. Now, if you look at, we also expanded the definition of far beyond those basic emotions. We talk a lot about social emotions now that we know were very important when human beings were nomadic and wandering and had to cooperate, wandering through the wilderness and had to cooperate with each other to survive. So pride, shame, guilt, awe, all these social emotions are emotions that help us interact with each other and cooperate with each other. So there's a lot more. You mentioned drive. So now many scientists view drives as a kind of emotion called a homeostatic emotion. They're an emotion that have to do very directly with maintaining the survival state of your body. So are you hungry? Are you too cold, etc. So we've expanded that. So and I guess I should say the biggest thing perhaps is that we've learned in the brain that it's much more complicated than saying fear is here and anger is there. So in all these different respects, we've gone far beyond the Darwinian theory, and we now view emotions as a kind of a categorization, a convenient kind of approximation to what's really going on. For example, we talked about fear and anxiety. They're different, but they also bump up against each other. Fear is a reaction to a specific danger in your current environment, something that's a threat. Anxiety is a response to something potential, and it doesn't even have to be definite. It can be even vaguer that something bad is going to happen. So anxiety and fear are somewhat related, but imagine you're walking through a forest, you see a bear come out, you have fear because it's a specific thing, it's the bear, and it's happening now. But you see some movement in the distance and you think maybe that's a bear, but maybe it's not, or maybe it's something else. So when you just have if you just see some vague movement, you have anxiety because you think some potential thing that you don't know about may happen in the future. And as you get closer and closer and start to realize it's a bear, at some point it becomes fear because you realize it's a bear, but it's a spectrum. There's not a sharp delineation. You can cut it here or there. And that really illustrates a lot about the categorization of emotion in general. Emotion is more like color, where you go from blue at one end to red at the other end. So depending on the frequency and where you along that frequency, what frequency you call red versus green versus blue, that's somewhat arbitrary, and that can be different in different cultures, and that's what happens in emotion. A lot of other cultures, especially ones that don't have quite the interaction that we all have in the Western world, that are more isolated, they have different words for the emotions. And not that they have different feelings, but they have different ways of describing and categorizing their feelings.
Yeah, what's surprising about Darwin getting it wrong was that the modern evolutionary psych interpretation of emotions is very Darwinian. That is, namely, for example, we have specific fears for things that would have been dangerous in our ancestral environment: snakes, spiders, darkness, uncertainty when you can't quite make out what's going on, the feelings of anxiety. And yet, if you drive down the highway at 70 miles an hour texting, you should be afraid for your life. And yet we don't think twice about it because there's nothing in our ancestral environment that would program us for that. That's very Darwinian. Or that the emotions we literally wear on our sleeves or on our faces as signals to our fellow group members, because emotions are also involved in sociality, and we're a very social primate species. And so we have to interact with others, and emotions are a way of signaling information between group members. And that's a very Darwinian way, because Darwin himself was, a supporter of group selection and thought, human groups were very influential in human evolution. So it's quite surprising he kind of missed all that in his own theory.
Well, but that part he got. So he, the role, the primal role of emotion in our ancestral existence, he got right, and he did that by studying animals, and that was true. But then when he tried to apply it to current existence, is where it went off rail, because what he didn't realize, and back then we didn't study the brain and the mind and thinking the way we do today, he didn't realize the positive effect emotion has on your decision making and your thinking, which has the effect of doing all those protective things that you just mentioned for animals in the wild. But if we go to a deeper level, what does emotion do? And one of the main points of my book is that emotion is not counterproductive, and it's not even separable from what you think of as your logical, rational thinking. If A implies B and B implies C, A implies C. Okay, you have that built into your head. That's logical, rational reasoning, processing. But you don't ever do that without a connection to an emotional state. All that processing that you're doing that seems like logical, rational processing is done so in a context, or is wrapped up in some emotion or whatever your emotional state is. So emotion is really a state of mind that and each emotion is distinguished by what kind of state of mind it is, what functional state it is in your brain. For example, the emotions will change which goals that you have that are important to you. It'll change your attention to sounds and sights in the environment. Often things happen. There's sounds or that you don't really register. Think of the cocktail party effect, where I'm talking to you, Mike, and we're having our old fashions, and we're focused on each other. But then someone says Michael Shermer in the background, and suddenly you hear what they're saying, because your unconscious mind has filtering this audio signal that's coming to your brain, and it's only offering you stuff that it thinks is relevant. Well, what it offers you and how excited, and how much attention you give to it depends on your emotional state. So your goals, the information, the memories that come to mind, and or the beliefs that come to mind, all these data and all these things that your rational mind is processing, they depend on your emotional state. So, for example, let me make it concrete. You're walking down the street. I'm gonna go see you, Michael. Let's suppose you live in downtown LA, and I'm gonna pick you up, and we're gonna go somewhere for dinner, and then see a play. Okay. As I'm walking, I'm thinking about, let's say, what path I should take. My goal is to get there quickly, be on time, right? And I'm thinking about what I'm going to order for dinner. I'm hungry, and I'm focused on that, and all these different thoughts. And so when I have to make a decision, do I turn left or right here? It's all based on that kind of thinking. Now, but if I think that, or realize, or think that I'm in a bad neighborhood, a high crime area, and I hear something, all my thinking changes. Now the goal, like the hunger, I don't feel hunger anymore. Okay, my goal, when I think about what path should I take to Michael's house, it's not what's the quickest, it's what's the best lit or the safest. And so all the sensory input that I get, the changes, the goals change, and the things that cross my mind that affect my thinking, the data that I'm processing, that's all selected by your unconscious mind. All that changes because I'm in a fear state. If I'm in a disgust state, it has a different effect. So disgust is associated with expelling things, right? Disgust arose because in our ancestral environment, there were things that were poisonous, mushrooms or rotting food or different, things that you better not eat. And rather than have an encyclopedia in your brain that tells you what to do when you have this kind of smell, that kind of smell, this kind of sight, that kind of sight, and have you automatically do it, we work in a somewhat more sophisticated way. Our brain takes in these bad sights and smells and creates disgust. Then your conscious mind can mix in and process other aspects of the environment and your situation along with the disgust and make a more informed decision about whether to eat it rather than a reflexive decision. And disgust is associated with getting rid of things. So when experimenters in the lab take subjects and they have a control group and they have another group that they induce disgust in, for example, they show them a very gross scene from the movie Trainspotting with a toilet and stuff, and they put them in a disgust state. Then afterwards, they ask both groups to sell them back some pen that they gave them to start with, okay? The control group, in general, asks double what the disgusted group asks. Even though the pen has nothing to do with their disgust, disgust puts your state of decision-making in an expelling mode, and these people want to get rid of the pen. They're going to ask less money for it than the people who are in the control group. So each emotion operates like that put your brain in a certain mode of processing whereby your decision-making and your behavior will be different depending on not only the logical processing, but the emotion that envelops it.
Yeah, so if I'm following this right, to answer the question, what are emotions for? They're kind of a proxy or a heuristic or an algorithm for calculations that we just don't have the processing or time to do, and natural selection did them for us. So if I think of hunger, I don't have to do any calculations. I don't have to think about how many calories my body needs, or I just feel hungry and I eat until I'm satiated, and then that's it. So that feeling, that emotion or drive or whatever word, is kind of a proxy for my body needing to do those calculations, or fear, anger, disgust, or whatever. It's kind of a shortcut. So I was thinking about this in the last chapter of your book. You talked about Danny Kahneman's System 1, System 2 thinking. System 1 cognition is rapid cognition. This is, the famous cognitive biases, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, availability heuristic, and all the dozens of others, which he described as shortcuts to cognition, just quick decision making. My instincts tell me it's that, not that, or my intuition tells me I shouldn't go there, but I should go there. In a way, it's like that's called cognition, System 1 cognition, but it's really kind of an emotion, isn't it? A feeling.
Yeah, but emotions interact with your unconscious, but it's your unconscious processing is broader than that because it's not. It involves. It interacts with the emotion, but it's not just emotion. For example, the cocktail party effect that I mentioned. There's auditory processes going on in your unconscious mind that you're not aware of all the time, and the filtering of finding a word that is relevant to you and making it salient or making you register in your consciousness is informed by emotion, but it's not emotion per se. It's just one of the functions of your unconscious mind. And I should say that.
Yeah, but I was remembering. Go ahead.
I was going to say I should say that. So one purpose of emotion is, as you said, it is a shortcut or an efficient way of having us react, as opposed to having to analyze each situation on its own. But there's another way that one could do that we do somewhat and other animals do more of, and that's reflexive reaction, where there's not even emotion involved, where you come upon a piece of meat, you smell it, and you gag and you vomit right away, or you just throw it down, you don't eat it, as a reflex, meaning that the same thing, the same trigger always creates the same response. And the problem, and a lot of animals work that way, and that works pretty well if you're not in a complex and changing environment, because over evolution develops this encyclopedia of rules for you. It smells this way, spit it out. If it smells that way, eat it. If it smells this other way, spit that out too. And you eventually get a whole encyclopedia. But then if you come to something that is different, that you haven't encountered, it's tough for that to deal with. And if you have a circumstance that makes it that negates the rule, that can't happen either. So, for example, my rule says if it smells this way, if the milk is sour, don't drink it. But what if I'm super hungry and malnourished? Maybe I should drink it anyway. That when you have an emotion, that adds that extra step of processing where you can have a more nuanced decision. So the smell makes you disgusted, but you're also aware that you haven't eaten in 3 days or you haven't had any liquid for a day, and you make a decision based on the emotion plus other considerations that allows you to make a more nuanced decision. So that's also a role for emotion.
Yeah, interesting. Like sailors that would eat leather shoes because it's an animal product when they were starving, washed up on an island or something like that. You'd read about these stories, or drink their own urine,
right,
and so forth. Yes, that's an interesting thought. Here, I was about to say something about Antonio Damasio's one of his earlier books. He talked about a subject that had brain damage to some part of his emotional brain. It might have been the amygdala or the limbic system or something, and the guy could not make any decisions because he couldn't feel anything. And so we think of, Mr. Spock making the right logical decision. That's not how decisions are made. So this guy apparently would stand in front of the toothpaste section in the supermarket going, I don't know which one to get. I got to weigh them and read the ingredients and, just be there all day. Whereas you and I just go in and like, well, I like the blue one because it tastes good or it looks good or I'm used to that one or I have a good feeling about that toothpaste. And then you're on to the next purchase item.
Yeah, that patient had damage that destroyed that the goal, destroyed the ability to perceive the goodness of different things. So everything was neutral, and that shows you how emotions motivate your decision making. Because if you don't have if I don't have any particular pleasure from the restaurant being crowded versus not crowded or whatever, then I can't make a decision, because on what basis do I make that decision? Your decisions are really emotion based, or they're goal based. But what's your goal is something that you desire. So that's a feeling, and so that's what drives you to make your decisions.
Yeah, I'm going to read a quote from one of my heroes, David Hume, that people often misinterpret. This is when he said, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." Now, he wasn't talking about just cut loose and party like it's 1999 and don't do any thinking. He was arguing that reason can get you to your goals better than non-reason. But the goals themselves, that's part of the passion system. Well, he used the word passion. So we'd probably say those are your emotions that are getting you there. So, why I can use reason to figure out my goals in love or careers or whatever, but I have to have a passion for, I want to marry that person or I want to pursue this career because that's how I feel. I feel better about that person or that career than others. And so that's my choice that my emotions make. And then reason is employed to get to those goals, something like that.
Well, that's true. And there's been quite a lot of work done studied on the pleasure centers, the reward centers of your brain, and what it means to want something or to like something, how those are different and so forth, right? But where he was wrong was that his separation of passions and reason, because as I said, we know today that you can't separate them, that yes, your emotions, your passions, your feelings are related to your goal selection, but applying the reason to get there doesn't happen in a vacuum. That reason is always married to an emotional state, and they together get you toward the decisions that you make to reach your goals. So they always work together.
Yeah, right.
Even in physics, so that's why I like.
Yeah, so that
even in physics, I like the quote that I have from Paul Dirac, one of the top physicists of the 20th century. And known to be Mr. Spock or Data, kind of Star Trekian, unemotional guy. But when they asked him what was your key to success in physics, he says, above all, listen to your emotions. So even in cut and dried physics, we know that it's your emotion that helps guide you when you have choices to make. You're not just cranking through mathematics where A plus B must equal C. There's actually a lot of decisions and choices to make along the way. Approximations you have to make, assumptions you have to make, interpretations you have to make, And all that is guided by your feelings and and actually your gut instincts, which are very closely connected with your emotion.
Yeah, is that what you guys mean when you talk about like it's a beautiful theory or it's a beautiful mathematical sequence or whatever? It's by calling it beautiful, you mean it just has a good sense or feeling about it?
Yes. So that's interesting. The aesthetic in physics is very interesting, and beauty in physics has to do with a a small number of parameters or equations or a very concise, compact expression, mathematical expression, having power to explain a lot of things. So Einstein's equations are they're probably the most beautiful in physics. It's one line equation. Now, albeit you need to have several graduate courses in physics and math to understand what the symbols mean in that line, but that's okay because that's how physics, with the power of physics. But that one line, okay, can explain all the gravitational phenomena that we experience: an apple falling from the tree, the Earth orbiting the sun, a black hole, the beginning of the universe. This huge range of things that have to do with gravity are all, we find we can describe them all using this one little equation with a few symbols in it. It's just so beautiful. I mean, if you're a physicist, it's amazing. And that's an emotion you feel. You're attracted toward it. You feel satisfied if you come up with it, or even if you use it and then you start interpreting it. It's very satisfying and makes you happy when you see how it works, and that it were the correspondence between the physical thing you're describing and then the math comes out and you go, wow, that is so cool. Whereas ugliness is the standard model of elementary particles, okay? The standard model, 2 pages of equations, 20 some parameters that are stuffed in there that you have to fix. You have no idea what their magnitude is, except that you do experiments and make measurements, and you say, okay, the mass of the electron is this, the charge of the quark is this, or whatever, and you plug those in, and you have all these interacting equations, and it's just a mess. Now, it's extremely successful. It's been tested trillions of times, literally in collisions in elementary particles and accelerators such as the LHC in Geneva, and it's always, except now maybe we found a couple things that don't work just this last year, but we'll see, because it's not, the data is not totally in yet, but it's worked extremely well in the realm of the other 3 forces of nature, the strong force, the electromagnetic force, and the weak nuclear force. But it's ugly, and everyone, that's one of the motivations for string theory, was to find a theory that is more satisfying, more beautiful, that you might love as opposed to hate.
That's really funny. So you're telling me like this search for a theory of everything, it's really kind of an emotional search for a beautiful answer that explains as much as possible.
Well, on one level, it certainly is, and that's all that's done is kind of in that context. That's why Brian Greene entitled his book on it 20 years ago, "The Elegant Universe." That's what we feel. We're looking for something elegant, but I mean, there are technical reasons for it too. The standard model does not describe, it describes 3 of the 4 forces of nature, but it does not describe gravity. So we need a theory, a quantum theory of gravity. Einstein's theory of gravity, as successful as it is that I've just described, is not quantum. We have to quantumize Einstein's theory of gravity. So string theory was supposed to do that, and it was supposed to unite that 4th force with the other 3 forces. And it was supposed to do it all in an elegant, beautiful way. It's not really worked out that way over the last 20 years or 30, actually 40 years. People have been working on it. That's another podcast, but it doesn't seem to be delivering on its promise after much work by some of the most brilliant people. But that just shows you. But they're all following their feelings about what to work. When you're a beginning physicist, you have a great selection of very different, really, fields or subfields to work on, and everyone uses their own feelings to guide them as to which one to engage in.
Let's go through these different theories of emotions in the history of psychology, just briefly, using an example here where I live up in the mountains above Santa Barbara, and I hike on these little single-track trails with my dog, and there's rattlesnakes up here. Okay, so let's say I'm going down the path, and all of a sudden there's a snake in the in the trail and I'm running, I hop over him, and all of a sudden, bam, I feel afraid. My heart rate goes up, and my blood pressure goes up, and so on. So did that happen physiologically because I was afraid, or am I after the fact saying, well, I was afraid, and the cognition was interpreting all those physiological changes? Or does it all happen so fast you can't say one happened before the other, or they're independent?
Well, that's a great question, and there are different views on it. And I think the view that I find most reasonable is a bit of a hybrid, but it's that your brain constructs emotion. So let me back up and talk about what that means. I wrote about that in my book Subliminal, how your brain constructs your total experience. And a lot of it is your unconscious mind. So what we find is that your consciousness cannot process a lot of data, like 10 bytes per second or something like that, whereas your unconscious can handle much more megabytes, right? And think about the data that's coming into you all the time. Think about the visual data that hits your eye, or the auditory data that comes into your ears. That all cannot be processed by your consciousness. God forbid that even I, as a physicist, I get, let's say, the data of what hit the rods and cones, and someone says to me, "Tell me what picture you're seeing." Let my unconscious mind do that. My conscious mind doesn't know how to do it. And what we find when we study the actual data that's coming in is that the data is not as clear. It doesn't really justify as clear a picture as you perceive. So in Subliminal, I have a photo that a neuroscientist at USC made, that it shows you what if you looked at the image that is literally coming to your retina, what would that look like? And it has a black spot in the center where your optic nerve attaches to your retina, so there's no data coming in, and then it's clear for a ring around it, and as you get past that ring, it's extremely fuzzy. Okay, that's the data. How does your eye create? That's not what you see. How does your eye create a real picture? Well, it uses a lot of different tricks, and there's different layers of processing. But for instance, your eye is constantly jiggling around in a very small amplitude, micro jiggles, and so it's moving that clear area around different spots. So it's kind of getting a sample, not just of where you were focused, but all around it. And it also has like Photoshop sharpening techniques, and so in the end, you get what you seem to be a clear picture. Well, it turns out that's just the way it works, period, for us. We have our view of the world is an illusion based on that kind of processing, our auditory view, our visual view, our view of people. You meet somebody, you get to know them. If you analyze later, let's say you had a transcript of all your interactions with somebody, you could try to analyze how much data do you have on them, how well do you know them. Well, except for perhaps someone that you're living with, you don't have all that much data on who that person is, and yet you have a feeling about that person, a pretty sharp picture of that person that's based on a lot of assumptions that you're making, filling in that you do, just as you do with vision. And emotion seems to work in the same way. So you're in a situation, and your brain is getting information on your bodily functions, on your heartbeat, how cold are you hungry, and so forth. And it's getting information from your ears and from your eyes. And it also understands the situation that's been developing over the last seconds or minutes. And you have a whole store of beliefs and memories all in your brain. And your brain is putting all that together at the same time and putting you in an emotional state, which you are then interpreting based partly on your cultural norms, your categorization, as an emotion. So I would go, I feel fear. I would interpret whatever, all that mixture of stuff happening simultaneously, and then I just say it's fear. Now, I know that fear of a spider and fear of suffocation, for example, feel different to me when I just think about them. Why should they're both in some sense the same thing, but I know that I'm categorizing because they're different, and in your brain, indeed, it is different. And the same thing is the joy that you get from a good meal, and the joy that you get from your child graduating from college, is that what's, in some ways it's the same, but in some ways it's not the same. Pain, which is a homeostatic emotion, is a headache like a burn. They're both very unpleasant, but how do I categorize? I've learned through my society that I had to categorize them as pain. But you go to other societies and they have different categories, especially, I mean, if you go back to societies that are very isolated, like in some languages, there's no word for, in one language at least, there's no word for sadness. And people describe their feeling in different ways. So, and so that's kind of how it works. It's not simple at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think all this that's right. Yeah, and all this processing happens so fast. You're talking milliseconds. That it's just too artificial to say, well, one happens, then the other happens, because there's constant feedback and it's happening so quickly. It really just happens at essentially the same time. So both theories are right, or a hybrid. I agree with you on that.
Yeah. And
but that takes us to this. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was talking about the Shakhtar-Singer experiment, which is kind of an interesting illustration.
Yeah. Do that. Yeah.
They were trying to illustrate how look at how you experience emotion, and they did something that I don't think you could do today. But they brought subjects into the lab and injected them. And one group had the control group got saline, the other got adrenaline, and they were all told that they were getting a vitamin. So and he was studying what kind of emotions they would interpret this as being, because adrenaline, a pump of adrenaline, comes from anger, from fear. So what they did was they took some of the subjects and they put them in a room with somebody who was angry and who had various reasons to be trashing the experimenters and the experiment. I don't know, like, why are they keeping us here so long? Or the room is so cold. Why don't they? Or too hot. Why don't they put up the AC, the cheapskates, or whatever they were saying, stuff like that. They were exhibiting anger about it. And the other group, the control group there was not, and they were comparing what do people report. And they found that the people who got the placebo injection were not affected by the anger. The same, they didn't report being angry, even though the angry person was there, and neither did obviously the people who had the placebo and were with somebody who wasn't angry. None of them felt anger, but the group that had the adrenaline, and were not told that it had any side, that the shot had a side effect, who believed that it was just a vitamin, they reported being angry if they were in the angry group, significantly more than the people who had that adrenaline shot and were the control group. People in the control group who had the adrenaline shot just said, I don't know, I feel like aroused, but they didn't report us an emotion. The people in the anger group interpreted it as anger because the context was created for them. So that just shows one illustration of how your brain is trying to make sense of things always, and it's creating a story for you. And that was the story.
So you have to have some kind of physiological reaction. That's part of it, not just the context and cultural interpretation.
Well, you don't have to. I don't. Well, what is a physiological reaction? There are physiological reactions tied that go hand in hand often with most emotion. Yes, whether you need a physiological reaction prior to feeling the emotion or vice versa, I mean, that's much more complicated. It goes probably. I mean, either way.
Here, I was thinking of in a reverse model in which the stimulation of something threatening or challenging or insulting generates stress hormones and physiological reactions. So here I was thinking of Richard Nesbitt's famous experiment where he was comparing students from northern states versus southern states. And he was developing this theory about a culture of honor that southern states have. The problem he was trying to solve is, why is our homicide rate so much higher in southern states than northern states? And his theory was that in a culture of honor, you have to settle disputes yourself because you can't trust the government. And democracy came late to the South versus the New England states. And the South was populated by people more from ranching communities, I think, in Europe. So they had to settle their own disputes versus farmers who had fences and so forth, and more democratic rules about conflict resolution. Anyway, so the setup for the experiment was he has subjects fill out some form, and then they have to walk down the hallway to turn the form into some other office. This is all a setup, of course. And along the way, there's somebody fiddling with something, and the shill bumps into the subject and says, "Asshole." And then the person is like startled, right? So the finding was that students from the North were almost apologetic. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. It was my fault. And, they scurried off. But students from the South were much more confrontational, like, oh, yeah, you want to take this outside, buddy? And then they drew their blood at the other end of the hallway. And the students from Southern states that got roused about this, they had an increase in stress hormones and testosterone, and they were like ready to get it on with these guys. Just, whoa, okay. So this was kind of confirming his theory about this sort of culture of honor. But that would show that a reverse, right? That the insult causes a spike in these kind of stress hormones or testosterone, which creates then a feedback loop of more emotions.
Right, but it's a chicken and egg question that when the person bumps you, does that automatically change your physiological state, and then you interpret that as an emotion, or when they bump you, do you have the emotion, and then that changes the physiological state? And
yes, good point.
I think it goes a little bit both. It's a loop, I think, and it depends on the situation very much.
And culture. So that gets us to back to Darwin, and that from Darwin to say Paul Ekman in the 90s, it's almost a century of a blank slate vacuum. And then it was Ekman that comes along and kind of reconfirms that those early ethology studies by Irenaeus Abel Ibisfeld, the German ethologist, who famously took pictures of people all over the world, and all smiles look the same and so forth. He had this kind of universal set of emotions that Ekman then apparently confirmed. But now bring us up to speed on that, because you write a lot about Lisa Feldman Barrett's challenge to Ekman's, and so this idea that there's a culture of honor and a culture of law and order or whatever, and this would produce different kinds of emotions in people. That would be an example of what Lisa would say is a culture-bound concept of emotions. There are no conceptually universal emotions in human nature, if I'm characterizing that right. But kind of bring us up to speed on that debate.
Well, okay. What Lisa says is that the naming or categorization of emotion is culture dependent. So it's not that different people in different cultures have different feelings, but that they describe them differently. They name them differently. Because emotion, especially in her view, is not a discrete, distinct thing. Like there's fear, like as I said earlier when I was talking about Darwin's theory, that there's fear which is unitary. There's only one thing called fear, and it's also non-overlapping with anxiety and all that. She does not believe in that. She thinks that there's millions or an infinite amount of different kinds of fear, and then the different emotions can be hard to differentiate. But in each culture, you make those choices, and you call this. You decide what to call these instances versus those instances. So that it's really a question of how universal. Well, the question is, okay, as scientists trying to decide, if we might all agree that the brain is not very appreciably from someone born in the States versus Malaysia. Let's say the hardware that you have, obviously you're nurturing, you're raising, getting raised does. The question is, how does that interact with emotion? And so what the original Darwinian idea was that these categories themselves are hardwired into our brain, so that we will have the same expression for, if I smile, that's not something I learned or was taught or I'm mimicking by growing up in a culture. It's something that is hardwired into my brain, right? And so what her criticism of that work is that the experiments or they would go and they would show tribes people these different expressions and try and have them match with the emotions, and she says that those studies were highly flawed, that they were very suggestible. They were I don't remember the exact details, but the methodology that they used was bound to produce the result that they got. And that then she points to other studies that went and did it differently in a more valid methodology, and found that that wasn't true, that wasn't really universal, and that supports her belief that these categorizations are somewhat artificial.
Right. So maybe we all feel guilt about different things, but culture tells you what you're supposed to feel guilty about. So supposedly, like sister wives do not feel jealousy marrying one husband and they share him, whereas you and I would not be vibing this whole let's share our wives concept in the reverse direction, say for us. And that would be a cultural definition, although I still have a hard time believing that they don't feel those things. But, again, how do you know what's in somebody's mind, heart and mind about feelings like that? But that would be an example that cultures are, telling you these are the sorts of things you should feel guilty about. But the idea, the universality is why you'd feel guilty about anything ever, anywhere.
And the question would be, how do you define guilt, and is there some overlap between guilt and shame, or some other definition that you would call? I tend to think that although Lisa has a good point that emotions are not unitary and that there's a spectrum, I do think that the categorization has some inherent meaning, that probably that there are processes in the brain, some category of processes that are more related to guilt, and that it's a category that is culturally created, but it does have some basis in physiological operation. Exactly how much, and I don't know. We don't know yet, but so I think the truth is somewhat in between the strict Darwinian view and her view that it's all like arbitrary, and I think most emotion researchers would feel that way.
Yeah. And then historically, too, you wonder, did people feel the same way, I don't know, 500 years ago? Or you think of these like witch burnings or pogroms against Jews, in which you read these horrible things that people did to these women and Jews, burn them alive in these locked up buildings. And it's just horrible. Or, the flames, just torching them right there in front of you. Where was their empathy circuit? Is that just a 20th century? We've developed our empathy and they just didn't have it. I mean, what were these people thinking? What were they feeling? And how do you think about it historically that way? Emotion.
Well, I think the emotional equipment hasn't changed much. Evolution for major alterations takes a lot longer than a few hundred or a few thousand years. But your hardware is the same, but your software is different because you grow up in a different culture. For example, I know, since my parents went through the Holocaust, I know a little bit about that, and I know that one of the things the Nazis did to enable their population to execute all these heinous acts was to dehumanize the Jews, to speak of them and as if they're some lower life form. So you don't have that empathy. You have they're trying to make the empathy for the person, minimize it, like the empathy you might have for a squirrel or a rat. And in fact, they're at the same time they're vilifying them. So that was a good choice. I made unconsciously squirrel and rat because at the same time as if they're trying to treat them as more primitive, they're also, which they're both rodents, the squirrel and the rat, but they're also making them primitive on the evil side. So it's the rat, not the squirrel. So you might actually have some empathy for killing a squirrel, but maybe less for putting out a rat trap because it's not a cute furry thing; it's an evil thing. And so the emotions were the same, but they're applied differently because what your brain is drawing from and making the decisions are your beliefs, your experiences, your culture. And that was so radically different that your emotions then, along with your rational thought, working together, create different decisions because you have that horrible background that you're working from. And I think with the witches, I don't know a lot about the witchcraft time, but I think that they were witches. They weren't really people in a sense. They were this evil beings, right? So
That was part of it. And also, we're saving their souls from Satan by burning them alive. So really, it's kind of, I'm doing this person a big favor by torching them. That was part of it. Also, there were social elements like getting revenge against people you don't like and that sort of thing, and taking their property. There were some negative practical aspects there. Yeah, so and then let's think about kind of the dark side of emotions. We see a lot of polarization now, political polarization. It's not that liberals and conservatives think each side is wrong about some particular policy, immigration or abortion or whatever, but that they're evil. And if somebody's evil, well, you have to destroy them. I mean, that engages some darker emotions that are not like, well, here's my rational arguments for why I'm pro-choice, and you have your rational arguments for why you're pro-life, and we'll debate it. No, that, you're evil and should be destroyed for having those arguments. And that seems to me a troubling turn of events in the last decade or so.
Yeah, and I talk about emotional contagion. And humans have a tendency to pick up on each other's emotions and to share them. For example, laughter. If you're watching a sitcom or a comedy show, they put a laugh track on or they tape it in front of a live audience and people are laughing, you have more of a tendency to laugh than when there's nothing there. I remember during the height of COVID when they were doing the late night talk shows without an audience, Colbert, who seemed to be funny when there was an audience, and they work up the audience to make them really lively, right? Behind the scenes, they work them up because they know it's important. Now, when I'm watching the same kinds of jokes without an audience, they would just fall flat, and I wouldn't feel like laughing. And we're built that way because we're social animals. And so, if you're hurt, Michael, and you feel pain, I feel the pain. If you're angry at some outsider, I tend to share that anger because we're going to cooperate together. And so, I think what's happened is that the certain elements in the media, for instance, Fox News, have found that this fear or this anger and fear, they can easily spread it, and it amplifies because we have social media where people can interact with each other about it, and they can really whip that up, and that creates a great goal orientation. That's one of the aspects of anger, for example, is making your goals as opposed to other people's goals more important, and motivating you to achieve those goals more than you might be if you were not in that state. And what they found is that they're getting people, though, to really get glued to their shows, and they get, in a way, almost addicted to their shows because it's all fueling that. So I think that has that sort of thing. I mentioned Fox, but whatever station it is that's speaking that way, that's whatever media is warning you about dire things that are going to happen and the evil people who are going to do them. They're basically profiting off building up the anger and getting you engaged with them and to keep coming back to their site or their channel.
Right. So this is the problem with social media. They have these engineers who study psychology of persuasion that tells us, how exactly to structure the social media sites to keep you addicted, which is their business model, basically. So that's another example of, I think, the dark side of emotions. Yeah, to be sure, let's be fair. Watching Rachel Maddow, I also get emotionally engaged and angry at the right. Those rich billionaires, look what they're doing. And I was just watching this new Netflix film, Don't Look Up, about the comet coming to destroy Earth as a metaphor for climate change. And the two evil villains in the film are the president, who's a kind of a mega-like Trump character played by Meryl Streep, and the other character is kind of a tech billionaire. So I pointed out on Twitter, most tech billionaires, they lean left. They're liberals. They're Democrats. It's the industrial billionaires that are leaning right. And people seem stunned to hear this. It's like anyone that likes to make a lot of money has to be a villain on the right. It's like, no, actually, that's not the case. But the film itself, I mean, those kinds of shows, they are very engaging. It's hard not to get angry. Or if you turn on Tucker Carlson for 10 minutes, he has that 10-minute opening segment. You just, at the end of it, your blood pressure is up, and it's like, those libtards, they're going to really destroy America. It's like, wait a minute. I'm watching a
Well,
show that's going to engage my emotions.
and it's and it doesn't even, and those are very vivid uh, offerings that tend to incite this in you, but it works even on a much more low key basis. They've studied social media like Twitter and Facebook, and they've done experiments where they'll inject into your stream some anger or fear, and they'll be analyzing people's Twitter streams, let's say, and then before and after that person injected into the stream that emotion, they'll find that they do an emotion analysis of the content before and after, and they find that it affects people. That having other angry people on there, and it starts them on a more angry social communication.
Yeah, I love that big study, the Twitter study you talked about in the book. I don't want to give too much away of your book, and we're coming up on we're going to hit an hour and a half here pretty soon, and I don't want to let go. What I think is the most important part of your book, that is emotional control, or I don't know, just being able to deal with your negative emotions. We all have that here. I'm not talking about psychopaths or the social media influencers. I mean, just regular people. I get angry. I get upset. I get thought flooding. And so, our friend Deepak Chopra, this is his whole thing, right? Is that you have to control these emotions bubbling up that interfere with your life, and we all have them. So talk a little about what we know about, controlling your emotions.
Well, let me start with what you don't do is suppress them. So a lot of people grow up, at least in the older times, and they were told to suppress your emotions. Don't, especially males, don't show your emotion. It's destructive. It's bad. Try not to feel. And people who do that, first of all, tend to be unhappier and more stressed out, and even they have lower life expectancies, because suppression is a very bad and destructive way to deal with your emotions. And there's been a lot of study in the last 20 years about what are the good ways to do it. Some of which were the ways were known, but now they've been studied, and we see the effectiveness. And my favorite one is called acceptance, which is a descriptive term. It harkens back to the Stoics, who preach that you should not expend any energy trying to change something that you can't change. So, for example, you have a picnic outside and it rains. You don't get angry at the rain, but let's say that you're accosted by somebody outside, and you get angry at that person. But that was probably a situation where you can't change that person's attitudes or behavior either, any more than you could change the rain. So the question is, why would you get angry at that person? It's counterproductive. So that's the idea. What you're trying to attain is a state where you only waste energy, or not, shouldn't say waste, where you don't waste energy, and you only spend energy on things that you can change. And what that involves is, when you're in a bad situation, accepting it and not becoming angry or sad or have any negative emotion about the situation, except in areas that can be productive for you. So I talk about a guy named Stockdale who was shot down over Vietnam, and then a POW for 7 years, tortured repeatedly, beat up, injured horribly, that received injuries that are permanent, and yet he became a leader in the prison. He survived longer than almost anyone else, and he went on to have a very happy and productive life. He was Ross Perot's running mate in the election in the 90s where Perot ran. He was became a general. And he says that the key to his survival, and he says that he noticed that people who didn't survive didn't do this, was acceptance. So instead of directing anger at the person who tortured you and imagining how you might get back at them, or how the war is going to end in 6 months, let's say, or a year, or whatever you were hoping it would, and that person would be thrown in jail and so forth. He had a more Zen-like attitude, and only focused on, now that he was beat up, how could he heal best? If he was cold, how could he stay the warmest? Not getting angry, but so this acceptance is a very Deepak Chopra-like approach to it, and it takes a lot of practice, but it's very effective. Another approach is called reappraisal. This one is, I think, a little easier to apply. An example here is I was driving to a meeting downtown LA, and there's a lot of one-way streets, and sometimes streets end for one reason or another. A lot of construction going on, and I hit a place where I'm just trying to get another block, and bam, the street's closed for construction, and it has a little detour sign, but it takes me in some screwed up way and makes me going to be late. And I felt like I was getting angry at, why can't the city just, how hard is it to put arrows on the right streets to get you around this thing? And as I felt myself getting angry, I realized, but you know what? At the meeting I'm going to, I'm not really looking forward to the meeting. It's going to be an hour and a half. And this way I missed the first 20 minutes. That's a good thing. And I'm going, well, people, and people know that I'm always on time for meetings, so they're not going to get mad at me. That's a good thing. So I started looking at the good sides of it. And that's what the reappraisal is, because the appraisal is you look at a situation and you go, city screwed me up. I'm angry. Anger comes from my appraisal of the situation, but a different appraisal of the situation is, okay, guess what? I get to miss the beginning of a meeting I didn't really want to go to, and I have a good excuse for it. Now I'm happy instead of angry. And the idea in reappraisal is there are often many, think of another one in traffic. A guy cuts you off. You think, what an ass, right? And you get angry at the person. He doesn't respect me. He puts himself above me. He's harming my ability to get where I'm going or whatever. Or you think, poor person, she's or he is late for something that's important, or maybe the kid is sick, or maybe the person is just oblivious, one of those people who's daydreaming and doesn't even realize what they did. So you appraise it differently and you have a different reaction to it. So that's what reappraisal is. So those are both good. And maybe I should one more, and that's expression. You may have noticed that talking about things sometimes diffuses your feelings. If you're very angry about something, for example, and I know people who will write a flame email to somebody that pissed them off, but then they won't mail it, right? They'll say, they don't say I'm not going to mail it, but they say to themselves, I'll mail it tomorrow. Let me look at it again tomorrow. And tomorrow comes, they go, oh my God, I'm glad I didn't mail that. And they've been diffused. So all these methods were. By the way, in the reappraisal, I want to add that these other stories you tell, you have to believe them. You can't just make up some random. You have to find other stories that you find believable. It's a spin. It's not fiction. But okay, all these ways are ways that you can help to regulate and manage your emotions when you find that they're getting in the way or they're becoming counterproductive, which can happen, because just like your visual system is very important to you, and you have optical illusions nonetheless and mirages, your emotional system is crucial, and it's operating on a second by second, minute by minute basis in your favor. But sometimes it gets out of hand, and then you use these methods.
Yeah, I've done that. I used to get angry when somebody would pass me on the freeway because I like to go fast, and then some guy would blaze past me, and I'm like, why does And then one day I was with one of my cycling buddies, and some guy blasts past me. And he goes, "There's your rabbit. Perfect. Let that guy get the ticket." I went, oh, it's a good thing for somebody to go faster than me. Then I won't get the ticket. He will. Okay. So from now on, whenever I get past, I think, oh, good. Lucky me.
I try.
That would be reappraisal. And I have, go ahead.
No, I was just, I try to do that. If someone goes a little fast, I go behind them and I go a little slower than them, and so eventually they're too far ahead, but they're going to be, they're like the canary in the coal mine.
Right. Yeah. And I've done that with the email thing where I'll write an angry email, something, and I'll send it to Jennifer or some friend of mine and say, I'm thinking about sending this. I kind of have a feeling maybe this would be a bad idea. What do you think? And I always get back the same answer. Thank God you didn't send that. Do not send this email. And then like 2 days later, I'm like, I don't know why I wrote that email.
Yeah.
But it felt good at the time. So that's the expression. You're expressing the negative emotion privately or in a small group where there can't be any consequences to the expression of the negative emotion.
Right.
Yeah, because that revenge emotion is pretty strong. It's probably there for a good reason. You don't want to be taken advantage of. And there's just enough freeloaders and cheats and psychopaths in society that they have to be stood up to. So you have to develop something of a reputation. Like I will get you back if you screw me over too many times. So that emotion's probably pretty primitive and valuable to a certain extent, but it could easily be hijacked if you're angry all of the time and getting mad over everything.
That's right. And don't forget, we have a lot more we have a lot more interactions today with other people, with many other people than we did in our ancestral period. You know, we may have lived in a community with 25 to 50 people 20,000 years ago, but today, not only do you see people in, you know, if you live in a city on the street all the time, but you have the telephone, and now you have social media that connects you with hundreds, thousands, millions of people. So you have a lot more interactions and a lot more active things going on in your emotional life and in your social life than ever before in our history.
Yeah, and I think they're the anonymity of a modern society. Somebody flips you off in their car. They're in their car, or somebody sends you an angry email or tweet. They don't even know who you are. You don't know who they are. There's just too much anonymity. So there's no risk of invoking anger back at you for saying something like that. You know, I'll occasionally get a super nasty email. I mean, just unprintable kind of stuff. And I'll write the person back saying, gosh, are you having a hard day? Or, I mean, what did I say that would upset you so much? Usually I get when I get a response, it's usually like, oh my God, I never thought you'd reply. Oh, well, I'm really sorry. I kind of overstated that. They're kind of apologetic about it because they just figured they're just throwing it at me from the, anonymity. And that's too easy to express those negative emotions.
Yeah, yeah. And the fun thing about writing the book was there's so many stories that you get of crazy emotional decision making. And when it go, I my point in the book is that talk about the effect emotions have on your decision making and the positive effect that it has and how it can't be separated. But I often illustrate this, and my editor would get pissed at, well, not he would get pissed, but he would point these out to me, like, why am I illustrating a point by showing its opposite? Because the cases where the emotion goes wild and goes too far are often so much more dramatic and interesting to read than a situation in which the emotion actually works properly, right? So I have a lot of those cases that I talk about that are just, whoa, that's crazy, but it shows the kind of thinking that emotion stimulates, even though in the case that I might be describing, it's a negative result because it was overdone. But at least it does illustrate what happens on a more productive basis, on an ongoing basis. But it was fun.
Yeah, you got a little personal you got personal in your book, though, talking about your parents, both of whom were in the Holocaust and obviously survived. But how do you survive that and not be angry the rest of your life at the injustice of it all? And how do you think about people that suffer like that? What's that book, Man's Search for Meaning? Viktor
Frankl.
Oh, what's
Frankl,
Viktor Frankl. That somebody who has a purpose or a drive, a meaningful life, even in the horrors of Auschwitz. The people that survive are the ones that were able to focus on something to get through this, this horrible life. And then afterwards, how are you not bitter the rest of your life? It's hard for us in our comfortable lives to imagine what that must have been like to go through that. But your parents did.
Yeah, and they reacted pretty differently. So a lot depends on your own prior emotional experiences and your emotional profile. What do you tend toward? So my mother, I don't know what she was before the war because I obviously didn't know her, but she was about 16 when the war started. She lost her mother and her sister her father. Her mother had already died, and her sister, whom she was very close to. And she came out of the war very fearful, pessimistic, and anxious, pathologically fear of losing everything again. And I have, for example, I used to, when I was in graduate school, I had a roommate who was a woman, and my mother would call me every Thursday night at 8 o'clock to just talk about life. And one time I didn't answer because I was out on a date somewhere, and my roommate answered because we only had one phone. That was before the cell phones, and she told my mother that I'm gone, and then so my mother calls back a half hour later, and oh no, he's still out. And my mother's starting to go, what? Really? And she starts to think that something happened to me. And then she starts calling more and more frequently. And then eventually she says, listen, and she called me Lenny. No one else calls me Lenny, but she said, hey, tell me the truth. Lenny died, didn't he? Tell me the truth. I'm going to find out anyway. And my roommate's like, whoa,
oh my God,
what kind of mother? It's like, when I got home, what's wrong with your mother? It's like, and then she just put the phone off the hook. And my poor mom, really, to her, it was real. This idea of losing everything because of her experiences was so real that she felt that. And I'm thinking, boy, am I that much of a loser that my mother would rather think that, or sooner think that I'm dead than I'm out on a date, But anyway, my father, on the other hand, was a resistance fighter in the war and ended up in the Buchenwald concentration camp, and he lost his whole family, plus his wife and his child. So he had in a way even more losses, but he came out and he was always a fighter and an optimist. And after the war, he stayed. He was always optimistic, and he seemed a lot less bitter than my mother, although they both had certain deep sadnesses. But how you react is very individual, and I think that in a way it's reappraisal at work on some level, or at least as some of an aid for my father, because I think he would tend to feel more grateful for what was saved or whoever did survive, and maybe my mother felt the opposite, more grieving for those who didn't survive. So it's a different way of looking at it. Michael, I always I know you write a lot about God and theology, and you used to be a believer, and it's one of those things that I always wonder about God, because when something good happens, we thank God, and when something bad happens, we say we ask God to to try to save us from it or to help prevent it. But it seems to be out of God's control. And it's too bad that the bad thing happened and God was forced to take us for some reason that we don't understand. But when a good thing happens, it's because God is benevolent. But people don't talk about God being, my parents had a very complicated association with God, because they were Jewish and observant Jews before the war, and after the war, they were very culturally observant. We followed all the holidays, went to the synagogue, and so forth. But if you talk to them about whether they believed in God, it was a mixed. You might get different answers because, they still had the remnant of their belief from earlier, but they also expressed that they didn't see how a God could exist who would allow the Holocaust to happen. And God is supposed to make this is the most perfect world, and somehow my mother's thinking, in what world is it perfect that my sister at age 19 was slaughtered? It's hard to understand that. So it's complicated.
Yeah, the problem of evil, to me, that's the biggest argument against the existence of at least an all-powerful, all-knowing, and benevolent, all-good God. Just you can have two of the three, but you can't have all three.
Yeah.
So maybe he's just incapable of doing anything about it. Or I guess one of the answers to the Holocaust question is, well, God granted us free will, and there's people that just chose to do evil. They're just evil people, and God, he could do something about it. He just doesn't, because this is part of the human world.
Right. Well,
to me, it's not satisfying. If I was your mother, I'd say, screw you.
Yeah. Well, for all God's children, I don't know. Some parents, I guess, put their children out there and say, whatever happens, happens. But I would think that a God, as a parent, would try to give them a good life and not let the evil happen. But
well, yeah, worse is natural evil. Why would God allow childhood leukemia? these poor kids suffer for years. The parents are affected the rest of their lives. It destroys families, and on and on and on. It's like that's not free will and volition due to the fall, and that's just shit happens. Why does that? What kind of moral character are you going to develop if you're dead? If you're the kid or the parents, why do they have to suffer? Isn't there some way to suffer a little bit to gain moral fortitude without having to be miserable the rest of your life because you lost a child?
Yeah. Yeah, I have no answer for that.
Yeah, there is no answer. That's why.
that's
So,
why the
I guess that's one reason
even the dog is upset by it.
Yeah, that's Hitch. That's, by the way, that's my dog's name is Hitch after Christopher Hitchens, and it's interesting.
Of course,
he
then.
chose to start barking at this very moment.
That's God sending us a message, Michael.
That's right. He is, yeah. So, yeah, okay. So let's just kind of wrap up by talking about one last subject that I thought was interesting in your book. Since you've written for Star Trek, does data have emotions? How could data get emotions? That is the problem of AI and emotions. And so here's a story I tell all the time when I met David Ferrucci, who was the chief IBM engineer behind Watson, who won Jeopardy, one of my favorite shows. And so I asked him, does Watson know that he won Jeopardy? I mean, was he excited? Like, I beat Ken Jennings at Jeopardy. I'm the world champion. What? Of course not. He doesn't even know he's playing Jeopardy. It's just an algorithm grinding through Wikipedia pages to answer these questions, right? But how would you know? I mean, if you program Watson to go, yay, and cheer and let out a big cheer that he won, but none of us would think, well, Watson's feeling happy that he won Jeopardy. We wouldn't think that. We'd think he's just programmed to scream or whatever. How would you ever know if data had emotions?
Well, that's in a sense, that's the Turing test that people have been debating for decades. How could you know that distinguish, say, a human from a robot? And it's difficult, and there's a large literature on it, and people disagree on how you would eventually could be able to tell. I think the bottom line is that it's very nuanced, and it's not a simple litmus test. So the way computers traditionally work is linear algorithmic programming. If A, then B, if B, then C, or so forth, and you put these kinds of rules together. If A and B, then D, or whatever you have, at its basis, it's a bunch of rules or switches that are binary, and if these rules happen, then this is what happens. And when I used to program years ago in a language called Fortran, it was all very. You would do a flow chart. You could describe your program with a flow chart. If this happens, that happens, and you could see how the data would be processed in a certain way. That's like long ago in our conversation today, I talked about reflexive behavior. That's what computers do. They follow rules, rule-based behavior, and when you have a system that operates that way, it's very hard to mimic anything like emotion or humanity, because humans react in such a nuanced way and such a complex way, and situations can have subtleties. And it's hard for a system of rules to seem to react authentically as a human in all these different situations, because you can't foresee them, and you can't program in that much subtlety. You just don't have the ability, or really the talent to do that, or the time to even put in those zillions of rules that you would need to account for your specific reaction to everything that would come up. Like the dog barking when I'm trying to talk. So traditional computer programs are a series of these reflexive rules: A, then B, and so forth. And primitive or low, primitive animals, more primitive brains behave that way. So humans do to some extent as well, but mostly we behave in a more nuanced way. Well, in the last 5 or maybe 7 years, there's been a revolution in computer programming, where computers are now the cutting edge of programming, and of the power that you can get from computers is a different kind of programming called neural net programming or deep learning. And that's really the kind of programming that your brain has. Those computers, even though the the hardware is the same or similar. They work much differently. So the way those work, they work like the neural nets in your brain. Your brain has 100 billion neurons, and they're connected to maybe 1,000 or a few thousand other neurons. And when they get so many input and they reach a certain level, they might fire, or other inputs might lower their ability, their propensity to fire. And it all happens on a neuron by neuron basis that are connected to other neurons, and somehow something emerges that we call thought and decisions. And that's the way these new computers are working. They're people are creating, in a sense, a series of nodes that are interconnected. They put data in on one end and have let's call it a reward or a result on the other end. And the computer, in a sense, by having repeated tests in which the reward indicates whether it got the right answer or not, it develops some sort of internal programming that gets you from the input to a very accurate output. So they're working somewhat in the same way as our brain. I mean, we're not anywhere near that now. We're not having 100 billions of things connected to each other by thousands of connections. And these are not general purpose neural networks. Each one is designed for a specific task. And so it's far, far, far from mimicking humans. But this kind of programming is the kind that has potential eventually in 100 years or 1,000 years, if we're still here, maybe I'm all wrong and it's 50 years, whatever, to actually start behaving like an animal or a human. And I believe that the potential there, at least the potential, maybe not engineeringly likely from the engineer's point of view, but from the physicist's point of view, theoretically possible, is that this computer programmed that way or designed in that way will develop emotions, will have emotions. You're not probably putting the emotions in, it's evolving them the same way that we evolved in the wild, right? That's what these are evolutionary learning programs. And by the way, I wrote a paper on that in the 1980s. So I should have kept going on that
You
field.
did?
It got quite big. Yeah, I wrote an evolutionary method for machine learning. In the 80s. So I was fascinated by that for a while. That was before neural nets got big. But that's a very interesting way. And that I believe, and I talk in the book about how we won't really get robots that seem like humans until that happens. I just think about like what if you were a robot and you're sitting there, and let's say the dog starts barking in the background, okay? Well, your programmer probably didn't have every eventuality in her mind when she programmed you, right? For instance, she may have not put in what if the dog was barking, or what if a cat is meowing, or what if a mosquito starts landing on your head. You can't think of all these things. So as a computer, that barking would go unheeded. Nothing would happen, right? Because that's reflexive program. That's the old kind of programming. But in the new kind of computer programming, if there's emotion there, if there's barking in the background, that barking is a more general category of things. It triggers, let's say, annoyance in you, an emotion, which motivates you. It's not in your program. I hear a bark, I get up and go. It stimulates an emotion that's very general. So it happens to encompass the dog barking. It's much more general. It encompasses anything that's disrupting. Let's say that's disruptive during an interview. That causes annoyance in Michael Shermer, and so Michael Shermer now, let's say the intelligent robot, when that happens, you're motivated to get up and do something about it. But a rule-based computer doesn't have emotions. Is not going to be is not motivated. It has to be told, do this and do that. So the motivation comes from emotion, and so that's when we have the potential for machines to really, seem human. Is when they can feel the emotion. So the data, when I used to write on Star Trek, we talked a lot of debates about data, how would data react to this and that. And if I was there today, what I would say is data is just going to sit there like a bump on the log 99% of the time until he gets an order to do something, because without emotion, he has no motivation. So what is data's goal? I mean, as you're interacting on this ship, if something happens that happens to trigger one of your pre-packed goals, you might get up and do something. Or if Picard says, Data, go do this, you'll go do that. Otherwise, you're just going to sit there and stare into space. Why would you even say hi to a fellow member unless you have a feeling of a feeling for that person, or for connecting with another human? So Data really was not, as portrayed, was not really emotionless.
Hmm. Interesting. Right. So you're saying it's an emergent property that comes out of these complex systems as they evolve. And at some point, the lights come on or the dimmer switch starts to move a little bit and you get a little bit more sentience or consciousness and of which emotions are a part. So that makes more sense. It's not something you can program. It's just going to happen. And so we'll just say in the sci-fi sense that uncanny valley is eventually going to be crossed. We're going to just all of a sudden just go, oh, wow. Okay. I think there's emotions there that weren't there before. Not quite sure what triggered that, but there it is. Something like that.
Right, right. And I have to say, it's one of the characteristics of neural networks that you don't understand what the computer's doing. So when Big Blue played chess and beat Kasparov, the programmers knew exactly how it was working and making its decisions. They had put in a tree with heuristics, a decision tree, and possible moves and so forth, and it was doing very fast calculations, which is not what Kasparov's brain was doing at all, right? So the computer was considering a billion possible moves and their consequences, and Kasparov was maybe 10, right? And he almost won, but he didn't win. But in the new neural network programs, like they have chess programs now that are far more powerful than that one, that easily beat anybody. And I think even in a small computer or an app that you can get online, I think on your phone can beat almost maybe not the top humans, but I mean, it's certainly the computer doesn't have to be such a big supercomputer anymore to do it. And it's working through neural network programming. So the programs don't really know where it gets its idea. And yet it has these brilliant ideas. I remember I was reading about one, I don't know if it was Go or chess, but I think it was chess, because I don't know how to play Go, and I think I understood what it did. But the computer made some really weird, off the wall, totally unmotivated seeming bizarre move, and then 5 moves later, checkmate. And the humans, when this move happened, going, I have no idea what good that. There must have been a glitch. This computer's having a short circuit, And now, if we didn't know that it was the computer doing it, you would say, my God, that guy is so creative, right? Because you would see just the move and you would attribute creativity. And in a way, that computer was exhibiting creativity because of the neural network system. It does has its own new inventions and ideas. It's not like the old computers were, they could create Mozart type of music. There were programs that could do that. People would put in the characteristic of Mozart music, and the computer they were smart enough to do it in a way that when the computer followed those rules, you got Mozart music. But now you got a computer where you don't tell him what Mozart is, you just let him compose himself, and you'll have a musical Mozart come out of that. That's really amazing, and that's what the future holds. But I think emotions, I said we have creativity now, but eventually we're going to have emotions coming out as well. The computer will just start jumping up and down.
I did it. Well, in a way, if I'm following you, you're saying that we don't know what's going to come out of it because we can't predict it. They're unpredictable.
Well, they're unpredictable, but they're also for currently, I'm not saying in principle, but they're not understandable either, because the neural networks are so complex. You can't tell what was going on. It's just, different switches being set and, whatever, and just different layers. And it's like looking into your brain. You can go, okay, here's the connections in my brain. Or we've done it now, let's say for a C. elegans, a roundworm. We've mapped out its entire neural system, and we can tell you if it's in this state or that state. I mean, we can list the different possible neuronal states, collective neuronal states, but doesn't really get us a lot further toward what is the C. elegans thinking, because it's just a very difficult connection.
Right. But what I'm asking is it ever knowable? That is, if you had Laplace's demon that knew every particle and motion and et cetera, and even adjusted for quantum effects at the subatomic level. Yeah.
You believe it too. I say it is knowable, and you agree with me, Michael. You know why? Because we believe that human experience in our brain and all our thoughts have a physical basis in the same laws of physics as the rest of the world. So given that, one could build theoretically a neural network computer that would operate in the same or a similar way, and this, whatever phenomenon it is amongst those neural connections in our brain, it could happen amongst those other neural connections, and we would have to call that an emotion. And if we are infinitely smart and study it, we'll understand how that works and why it happens. And let's talk again in 1,000 years and see if we got there, or maybe 100. It's so hard
or
to predict,
100 years,
right? Or 100 years. Yeah.
Yeah. It could be we've just gone about trying to understand consciousness and emotions as a subdivision of that incorrectly all these centuries, and that it's going to be an emergent property. I was just reading Anil Seth's book on consciousness, and he makes the analogy that the hard problem of consciousness is like how scientists thought of life, like a century ago or a century and a half ago, when the idea of a elan vital was popular. Well, it has this life force that's in there, and we got to drill down and find that life force. And the more we drill down, there's no life force. And then all of a sudden, everyone quit talking about the elan vital. There is no life force. All these systems, and life just emerges from all these systems. He thinks consciousness is going to be something like that. We'll just quit talking about it. It's just an emergent property. It's what happens when you have these neural networks, as you've just described.
Yeah, that could be. Certainly, I would think that we would stop looking for the physical seat or soul that causes consciousness and realize that it's a distributed emergent property of the collection of neurons in your brain.
Right. Still a physical system, but not in the way we often think of it, in that kind of mechanical Newtonian way of billiard balls hitting each other. And yeah.
Right.
Well, Len, that's a good place to end it. We've now solved the problem of consciousness, life, free will and determinism, the nature of computing. Let's see, artificial intelligence, and God.
And God. We've solved them all, and it's all in the book. It's all in the book, everybody.
It's all in your book. That's right. Book. Yeah. So, Len, you always have lots of projects going on. What's next on your writing plate?
Well, I'm looking at another follow-up, a kind of a more of a sociology science book, and I'm also working on a novel because I thought it's about time I wrote a physics novel. It's a thriller. The characters are physicists, and the plot is very physics heavy. And I'm thinking, it's I know that world really well, and I think I can portray it well, and I think it's very exciting plot. And even more important, I've had a great time working on it. So that's the most important thing for me, is that it's fun.
You might be the next Michael Crichton. I was just watching Andromeda Strain the other day. Andromeda Strain seems rather prescient these days, given that we're in a pandemic. But yeah, there's nothing better than good science fiction. So, all right, Len, thanks for your book. Thanks for your work. And thanks for your friendship, of course, and for coming on the show to talk.